Hello and welcome to A Night in the Life of. Before we begin, I would like to state that while these videos are intended to be long and soothing, I do care about the historical accuracy, so if you discover any inaccuracies while listening, I would appreciate it if you would leave a comment telling me and everyone else of your finding. And if you enjoy these videos, I would love it if you would like and subscribe, as it does help the channel immensely and allows me to keep making these videos. Now let us begin. Tonight we are going back to one of my favorite periods in history. We are going to the age of the Vikings. Not the Vikings of Hollywood, not the horned helmets, not the mindless raiders. Those images are largely myth, and tonight we are setting them aside entirely. Instead, we are going to follow one ordinary family through an ordinary day. We are going to sit with them in their home. We are going to smell their food. We are going to watch their children play in the long summer light. We are going to listen to the fire crackle and the wind move across the fjord outside their door. We are going to find out what it was actually like, the texture of it, the quiet of it, the warmth of it, to be a person living in the Viking Age. So make yourself comfortable. Let your body settle into wherever you are resting tonight. Let your breathing slow down, and let me take you back. The Viking Age, as historians generally define it, spans roughly from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, from around 793 AD, when Norse raiders famously struck the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of England, to around 1066, the year of the Norman conquest of England. But here is the thing about those dates. They mark the beginning and end of an era as seen from the outside, from the perspective of the people who were raided, who were traded with, who were encountered across the known world by Norse seafarers, for the men and women living in Scandinavia itself, in what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Life continued as it always had. Seasons turned, children were born, bread was baked, the fjords glittered in the summer sun and froze in the dark months of winter. Most Vikings were not raiders or great warriors. Sure, they could probably knock most of us on our behinds and swing an axe with decent skill, but it was not their main vocation. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand before we go any further. The word Viking itself likely comes from an Old Norse word, vik, meaning a bay or inlet. A Viking in the original sense was someone who went out from the bay, someone who made voyages. And yes, some of those voyages were raids, but most were not. Most were trade expeditions. Most were explorations. And the great majority of the Norse people never went a Viking at all. So to even call them Vikings is a grammatical error in itself, since Viking was, and in some ways is, a verb. They were farmers, they were fishermen, they were craftspeople, blacksmiths, woodworkers, weavers, potters. They were poets, they were parents, they were neighbors, and it is their lives, the quiet, everyday, ordinary lives of these people, that we are going to explore tonight. The world they inhabited was defined, above all else, by landscape. Scandinavia is a place of dramatic contrasts. In the west, in Norway, the land rises steeply from the sea in great walls of rock, the famous fjords cutting deep inland, creating thousands of miles of sheltered coastline. Farming here was difficult. The soil was thin and stony, hemmed in by mountains that seemed to press the settlements toward the water. People here were almost always within sight of the sea, and the sea shaped everything: their economy, their culture, their imagination. In Denmark, where I am from, by the way, the land was flatter, more generous. Rich farmland spread across the low hills. Here the growing seasons were longer, the harvests more reliable. Towns could grow more easily, trade routes could develop, and the Norse people here built some of the most sophisticated urban centers of the early medieval world. In Sweden, the landscape shifted again. vast forests, great lakes, long rivers that wound down toward the east and opened onto the trade routes to Byzantium and beyond. These three landscapes produced three subtly different cultures within the broader Norse world, but they shared a language, Old Norse, a rich and complex tongue that gave us eventually many of the words we still use today. Sky, egg, knife, husband, window. These words came to English through Norse, carried across the centuries like seeds. They shared a religion, the old gods, Odin and Thor and Freya and the rest of the vast Norse pantheon. A religion that infused every aspect of daily life, from the names of the days of the week to the rituals surrounding the planting of crops and the launching of ships. Their gods were more of an aspect of nature than anything else. Thor was not just the god of thunder, he was the thunder. Njord did not rule the seas, he was the sea. Odin walked among them spreading wisdom and omens. The gods were not religion to them, they were reality. And they shared a social structure, the Norse peoples, a world organized around family, community, and a concept of honor that was both deeply personal and intensely communal. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin at dawn. Imagine a morning in late spring. The year is perhaps 900 AD. The place is a farmstead on the western coast of Norway, somewhere in the region we might today call Hordaland, a land of steep green hillsides and cold, glittering fjords. The farm sits on a narrow shelf of flat land between the mountains and the water. There is a longhouse at the center of the farm, the main dwelling, and around it a cluster of smaller outbuildings, a barn for the animals, a separate small structure used for storage, a forge perhaps where iron tools are made and repaired. The longhouse itself is a remarkable structure. From the outside it appears almost to grow out of the earth. Its walls are made of heavy timber posts and planks, with turf, dense, thick, living grass, layered over the outside for insulation. In some regions, the walls themselves are built primarily of turf, with timber used only for the internal frame. The roof is low and deeply pitched, also covered in turf, so that in the height of summer the building appears to be a long, low green hill. Flowers sometimes blooming from the roof, birds occasionally nesting in its edges. The longhouse is long, as the name suggests. This particular one might be 15 to 20 meters in length, perhaps 6 or 7 meters wide. It is a single room open from end to end, though the space is divided by function and by the placement of furniture and fire pits. Inside it is warm. This is the first thing you would notice, stepping through the low doorway. After the cool morning air outside, the interior of the longhouse is thick with warmth, the residual heat of the fire that has burned, banked low through the night. The air smells of wood smoke, of the faint tang of animals, of the dried herbs that hang in bundles from the roof beams. There is a sweetness underneath it all, from the hay stored at the far end of the building, where the livestock were kept through the winter, though by late spring most of the animals are already out on the hillside pastures. Along each of the long walls runs a raised platform, perhaps half a meter high, a meter or so wide, covered in furs and woven blankets. These are the sleeping benches. During the day they serve as seating. At night the entire household, the farmer and his wife, their children, perhaps an elderly parent or two, the farm's thralls and servants, all sleep here, wrapped in wool and fur, their heads toward the wall and their feet toward the central fire. There are no individual bedrooms. Privacy, as we understand it, barely exists. The household is a unit, a single living organism, and the longhouse is its body. Now the morning begins. The first to stir is usually the woman of the house, the husfreyja, the house lady, whose authority within the domestic sphere is absolute and recognized by law and custom alike. She carries, quite literally, the keys to the household. A bunch of iron keys hung at her belt was the symbol of her status. The keys to the storage chests, to the larder, to the locked boxes where valuables were kept. No one could access these stores without her permission. She rises quietly in the gray pre-dawn light, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders. She is perhaps in her early 30s, though she would not count her age the way we do. Time was reckoned differently. She knows that she has lived through perhaps 30 winters, that her eldest child is old enough to help with the milking, that her youngest still nurses at night. She moves to the central hearth, a long rectangular depression in the earthen floor running nearly the length of the room, and crouches to coax the banked embers back to life. She adds small pieces of dried wood, blows gently, waits for the flame to catch. This is one of the most important tasks of the morning. Fire was not taken for granted. The ability to make fire, with flint and steel and a small piece of charred cloth called a char cloth, was a skill everyone had, but losing the household fire overnight was an inconvenience and a minor embarrassment. The fire catches. Flames lick upward and the room shifts, shadows retreating, the carved wooden posts of the roof structure emerging from the darkness, the faces of sleeping children softening in the warm orange light. The husfreyja stands and moves to check on the children. There are 3 of them, a girl of perhaps 8, a boy of 5, and a baby of perhaps 18 months who is tucked between her older siblings for warmth. The girl is already stirring, blinking in the new light. The boy sleeps on, one arm thrown over his head. The baby makes a small sound, not quite waking, just shifting. She touches the girl's hair. "Get up," she says softly. It is morning, and the day begins. The first meal of the day was what we might call breakfast, though the Norse did not necessarily think of their meals in quite the same regimented way we do. In general, Norse people ate 2 main meals a day. The first meal was eaten in the late morning, after the earliest chores had been completed. The second, nattmal, or night meal, was eaten in the early evening. In between, people might snack as they worked, but formal cooking happened twice. Before the morning meal, though, there was work to be done. The girl, let us call her Astrid, one of the most common female names of the era, meaning something like divinely beautiful, pulled on her dress and her shoes and went out with her mother to check on the animals. The dress she wore was a simple linen underdress, covered by an outer dress of wool, dyed a soft reddish brown with plant dyes. Over this she wore 2 small rectangular panels of cloth, a front panel and a back panel, suspended from her shoulders by a pair of oval brooches made of bronze. These were called a hangarock or smoker, a kind of pinafore overdress, and they were the characteristic garment of Norse women and girls throughout the Viking Age. The brooches holding them in place were not merely functional, they were beautiful, cast in intricate interlacing patterns, sometimes inlaid with colored glass or amber. For a wealthy woman, these brooches might be made of silver or even gold. For Astrid's family, comfortable farmers, not wealthy nobility, they were good quality bronze, and she wore them with pride. Her shoes were made of leather, soft and low, wrapped around the foot with simple thongs. They would not last long on the rocky ground of the hillside pastures. Shoes wore out quickly and needed constant repair. Outside, the morning air was cool and clean, tasting of salt from the nearby fjord. The sun had not yet crested the mountain behind her farm, but the sky above was pale gold, and the water below glittered silver. The animals needed to be let out. There were cows, 3 of them, a breed smaller and hardier than modern dairy cows, with shaggy reddish coats. There were sheep, perhaps a dozen, their winter wool already growing thick again. There were goats, which were better suited to the rocky hillside terrain than the sheep. There were pigs, kept in a separate pen near the edge of the farm, and there were chickens, which more or less looked after themselves. Astrid opened the barn and spoke to the cows by name as they lumbered out into the morning. Animals were not anonymous to Norse farmers. They were named, their personalities noted, their moods attended to. The cows would graze on the hillside pasture above the farm, watched by the family's dog, a large gray-coated animal that took this responsibility very seriously. The milking was done here in the yard, before the cows were released up the hill. The Husfreyja milked quickly and skillfully, her hands moving in a practiced rhythm. Astrid milked the second cow. She had been doing this since she was 5, and her hands were strong and sure. The warm milk steamed in the cool morning air, filling the wooden bucket with a soft hissing sound. The milk would be used this morning, some of it, for breakfast. The rest would be set aside in clay pots to sour. Viking dairy culture made extensive use of skyr, a thick fermented dairy product something like a very thick yogurt, which was both nutritious and remarkably shelf-stable. You can still find skyr on the shelves today in Scandinavian grocery stores. Butter was churned and salted. Cheese was made and aged. In a world without refrigeration, fermentation was one of the primary technologies of food preservation. Back inside, the Husfreyja began to prepare the morning meal. The central hearth served both as the home's heat source and as its kitchen. Over the fire, she hung a heavy iron pot from a chain attached to the roof beam above, a long chain with adjustable links that allowed the pot to be raised or lowered to control the cooking temperature. This pot had cost the family significantly when they acquired it. Iron was not cheap in the Viking Age. A good iron pot was a serious household investment, passed down through generations, mended when cracked, treasured. Into the pot went water and then oats. Porridge was the foundation of the Viking diet. This is not glamorous, but it is true. For ordinary people, the farmers and the fishermen, the craftspeople and the servants, the morning meal was almost always some form of porridge. Oats, barley, or rye were the primary grains of Scandinavia. Wheat grew better in southern Europe and was an import, expensive, reserved for special occasions. This is why, to this day, rye bread is a staple in most Scandinavian households, and something some families even bring with them when they go abroad. But oats and barley were hardy enough to grow in the short Nordic growing seasons, and they formed the caloric backbone of everyday life. The porridge simmered slowly over the fire. To it, the Husfreyja added a handful of dried bilberries that had been gathered from the hillside the previous autumn and carefully dried and stored. Bilberries, small, dark, intensely flavored wild berries, were a common addition to food throughout the Norse world. They added sweetness, but more importantly, they added nutrients that were hard to come by in the long winter months. She added a small amount of butter, which gave the porridge a rich, slightly nutty flavor. She added salt, precious, expensive salt, kept in a sealed wooden box near the fire. And then she added a small amount of honey, stirred in at the end. The smell of it filled the longhouse, warm and sweet and thick, wrapping around the sleeping family like a second blanket. One by one, the children woke. The boy, let us call him Leif, one of the most enduringly popular Norse names, meaning heir or descendant, sat up on his sleeping bench and rubbed his eyes. He was small and round-faced, with a shock of pale blonde hair that stood up wildly in the morning. He looked at his mother. He looked at the pot over the fire. He jumped off the bench and ran to the hearth, holding out his wooden bowl. "Wait," Astrid said, laughing softly. He waited, barely. The porridge was ladled into wooden bowls. There were no matching sets of dishes in this household. Each bowl was slightly different, carved at different times by different hands. Some were smooth and well finished. One of the children's bowls had a small carved fish on the handle, done years ago by Astrid's grandfather as a gift. They sat together on the sleeping benches near the fire. No chairs, Chairs were for the very wealthy, or reserved for formal occasions. The bench was perfectly comfortable, the furs piled behind them soft and warm. They ate in companionable quiet, the fire crackling, the dog lying nearby with one eye hopefully open. Along with the porridge there was bread, a flatbread made yesterday and still soft enough to eat, baked on a flat stone beside the fire. It was denser and darker than modern bread, made from coarsely ground barley flour. It had a slightly nutty, earthy flavor. Spread with butter, it was deeply satisfying. There was skyr, thick and slightly sour, sweetened with a small amount of honey. And there was water to drink. Cold, clean water from the spring above the farm, stored in a wooden barrel near the door. For the adults, there might also be ale. Not the strong, intoxicating ale of a feast. This was a mild, low-alcohol, everyday ale, more nutritious than intoxicating, something like the table beer brewed across medieval Europe for precisely this reason. Water sources were not always reliable, and mild ale, fermented safely, was often the sensible choice. They ate, the fire burned. Outside, the sun finally crested the mountain, and a shaft of gold light came through the smoke hole in the roof and the small openings near the eaves. The longhouse interior brightened. A new day in the Viking Age had begun. The farmer, the husbandi, the householder, from which we get our modern word husband, had been awake since before the porridge was ready. He was a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical strength that comes not from exercise, but from a lifetime of heavy work. His hands were thick and calloused. There was a scar along his left forearm from a woodworking accident years earlier. His beard was neatly trimmed. Viking men, contrary to popular imagination, paid considerable attention to their appearance and personal grooming. Small folding combs of bone or antler have been found in enormous quantities at archaeological sites across the Norse world, carried by both men and women as everyday personal items. He had a name, this farmer, something like Bjorn, Bear, or Gunnar, or Ulf. Common names, solid names, the names of working men. He had already been out to check the barley. The growing season in coastal Norway was short, perhaps 4 to 5 months of reliable warmth. Every day mattered. Spring planting needed to happen at exactly the right time, and watching the fields for frost, for flooding, for the first signs of growth was a near daily ritual. The barley was coming in well this year. The winter had been cold, but not brutal. The snow had melted at the right time. The field, a small rectangle of laboriously cleared and tilled land on the flattest part of the farm, showed rows of pale green shoots, delicate and promising. He stood at the edge of the field for a long moment, just looking. This was the rhythm of his life, not the drama of raids and battles, which touched most Norse farmers rarely if at all, not the glory of sea voyages to distant lands. The rhythm of his life was this: the field in spring, the fish in summer, the harvest in autumn, the long, careful work of winter. Year after year, season after season, he was not a wealthy man, but he was free. And in the Norse world, this was the most important thing. The social structure of Viking Age Scandinavia was divided broadly into 3 groups. At the top were the jarls, the aristocracy, the powerful landowners and chieftains. Below them were the carls, the free farmers and craftspeople, the backbone of Norse society. And at the bottom were the thralls, slaves, people captured in raids or born into servitude. This farmer was a carl. He owned his land. He answered to no lord directly, though he owed certain duties to the local chieftain and participated in the ting, the communal assembly where free men gathered to make laws, resolve disputes, and conduct the business of the community. His freedom was the foundation of his identity. It shaped how he stood, how he spoke, how he looked other men in the eye. After breakfast, he went to work. The spring plowing was largely done, but there was always more to do. Fences needed to be repaired. The low stone walls that divided the home field from the pasture above had shifted during the winter, and several sections needed to be rebuilt. He worked at this steadily through the morning, moving slowly along the wall, lifting stones, fitting them together with practiced ease. There were always tools to maintain. The iron-tipped wooden plow, the ard, a simple scratch plow that broke the surface soil without fully turning it, needed a new wooden handle after the old one split during spring plowing. He had already selected the piece of wood for this, a length of ash, strong and flexible, and it was soaking in water in the barn to make it more workable. There was timber to cut. One of the smaller outbuildings needed a new roof section, and the roof required straight lengths of timber that he would need to cut and split from one of the birch trees at the edge of the home field. He would do this in the afternoon when the light was best. But first there was fishing. Almost every Norse coastal farm depended on the sea as much as the land. The fjord below the farm teemed with cod, herring, and other fish throughout the warmer months, and a good morning's fishing could provide food for days. He took his small wooden rowing boat, a practical, flat-bottomed craft very different from the famous dragon-headed longships, out onto the fjord while the morning was still fresh. The water was cold and absolutely clear. He could see the bottom in the shallows, gray stones covered in dark seaweed moving slowly in the current. Farther out, the fjord deepened to an almost impossible dark blue, reflecting the pale sky above. He rowed steadily and in silence, enjoying the particular peace of early morning on the water. The fishing lines were simple, strong cord with bone hooks, baited with small pieces of dried fish. He dropped several lines over the side and let the boat drift slowly, watching the water. A seal surfaced nearby, regarded him with large brown eyes, and dove again. He watched the ripples spread and disappear. The fish were biting this morning. Within an hour he had a good catch. 6 cod and 2 larger fish that he couldn't quite identify, but which looked promising. He pulled up the lines, rebaited, dropped them again. By the time the sun was fully up and the morning had warmed, he was rowing back toward the farm with a satisfying weight of fish in the bottom of the boat. On the shore, Astrid was waiting for him. She had been sent down to help clean the catch, a task she was old enough for now, and one she performed with the calm efficiency she brought to everything. They sat together on the flat rocks near the water's edge, working quietly. He told her the names of the fish as they worked. She already knew them all, but she listened anyway. While her husband was on the water and her daughter was tending to the morning chores, the husfreyja was at the loom. The loom stood near the wall of the longhouse, in the section where the light was best, close to one of the small openings near the eave that let in air and daylight. It was a warp-weighted loom, one of the oldest technologies in human history, consisting of a simple wooden frame from which the vertical threads hung down, weighted at the bottom by fired clay or stone weights to keep them taut. She had been working on this piece of cloth for 3 weeks. It was going to be a new overtunic for her husband. A length of dense, heavy woolen cloth in a natural brown color, with a border pattern in a darker brown that she was working now, passing the horizontal threads over and under in the rhythmic pattern she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from hers. Weaving was not a secondary skill in the Viking world. It was one of the most economically significant activities on the farm. Cloth was wealth. Good woolen cloth was traded, gifted, used to pay debts and obligations. The sail of a Viking longship required an enormous quantity of densely woven, specially treated woolen cloth. Modern estimates suggest a single ship's sail required the wool of perhaps 200 sheep, processed and woven by skilled hands over months or years. The women who produced this cloth were not doing domestic busywork. They were producing one of the most valuable commodities in the Norse economy. The husfreyja wove with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were making. Beside the loom, in a small basket, were her other tools: bone needles of various sizes, small iron scissors, a spindle whorl, a small circular weight that kept the spindle spinning as she twisted raw wool into thread, a pincushion stuck with needles. She hummed as she worked. The song was an old one, something her grandmother had sung, its origins lost back through the generations to a time she could not quite imagine. The words were about a ship going out in the morning and coming back in the evening. The ship always came back in this song. From time to time she paused to tend the fire, to check on the bread she had set to bake beside the hearth on its flat stone, to nurse the baby who woke and then dozed again in the fur-lined wooden cradle near the warmth. The management of the household was a complex logistical operation. In the storage chests and the small outbuilding used as a larder, she kept careful mental inventory of everything the family had. How many sacks of grain remained from last year's harvest, how many months they needed to last, how much dried fish was left, how many crocks of preserved vegetables, how much salted butter, how many wheels of cheese. The decision of what to eat each day was not casual. It was strategic. Feed the family too generously in winter and you ran out before spring. Feed them too carefully and you risked weakness and illness. She also managed the farm's relationships with its neighbors. Guests were a serious matter in Norse culture. Hospitality, the duty to welcome and feed and shelter travelers, was not merely a courtesy. It was a sacred obligation, connected to the deepest values of the culture. The god Odin himself was said to travel among humans in disguise, testing their hospitality. To turn away a traveler was not just rude, it was a kind of moral failure. At the same time, guests cost resources: food, drink, shelter, the time spent in hosting. Balancing genuine generosity with the practical needs of the household was a continuous negotiation, and it fell primarily to her. She managed the thralls too, the two unfree workers who lived on the farm and performed the heaviest and most unpleasant tasks. Their status was low, their freedom non-existent, and the Norse did not sentimentalize this. Slavery was a straightforward economic institution in the Viking world. At the same time, thralls were integrated into the household in a way that would have seemed strange to slave owners of later eras. They ate at the same hearth, sometimes slept in the same building, and were occasionally, over years of service, granted their freedom. She was not cruel to them. She was not particularly warm either. They were part of the household machinery, and she managed them with the same practical efficiency with which she managed everything else. By mid-morning, the cloth on the loom had grown by several centimeters. The bread was done. The baby was fed and contentedly watching the fire from the cradle. The smell of baking filled the longhouse. She straightened up from the loom, pressed her hands into the small of her back, and looked around at her domain. Everything was in order. Leif had been given a task this morning. He was to collect firewood from the pile behind the barn and stack it inside the longhouse near the door, replenishing the supply that had been burned down over the past several days. It was a simple enough job, well within the capacity of a 5-year-old. His father had shown him how to carry the wood without dropping it, how to stack it so it wouldn't topple, how to sort the larger pieces from the smaller kindling. He had been doing it for 20 minutes, and had so far brought in 4 pieces of wood. The problem was the dog. The dog had decided that the firewood carrying operation was in fact a game, and that the game involved taking pieces of wood out of Leif's arms and running away with them. Leif pursued the dog. The dog dropped the wood, picked up a different piece, and ran again. Leif shouted. The dog wagged its tail. Eventually his mother appeared in the doorway, took one look at the situation, and spoke a single firm word to the dog. who immediately sat down and assumed an expression of perfect innocence. Leif retrieved the scattered wood, somewhat breathlessly, and finished his task. This was childhood in the Viking Age. It was not the childhood of modern Western culture, with its segregation of children from adult concerns, its emphasis on play as a separate sphere from work. Norse children entered the world of adult responsibility gradually but early. By Astrid's age, 8, a girl would be expected to contribute meaningfully to the running of the household. By 12, both boys and girls were considered to be approaching adulthood. This does not mean childhood was grim or without joy. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of a culture that genuinely delighted in its children. Small wooden toys, carved horses, miniature boats, simple dolls, have been found at Norse sites across Scandinavia and beyond. Knucklebones and dice have been found, evidence of games. Skates made from animal bones have been discovered, used to glide across frozen ponds in winter. Children played. They ran and shouted and chased each other across the farmyard. They slid down snow-covered hills in winter. They swam in the fjord in summer, shrieking at the cold. But they also worked, and perhaps more importantly, they watched. The transmission of knowledge in an oral, pre-literate society, and the vast majority of Norse people could not read or write, though the runic alphabet existed for specific purposes, happened through observation and apprenticeship. A child learned to weave by watching her mother weave, then by doing it herself under guidance, then by doing it alone. A boy learned to fish by going out with his father, watching, listening, gradually taking on more of the work. Astrid this morning was learning to gut fish. She had done it before, but not confidently. Today her father was patient with her, showing her again how to hold the knife, how to make the cut, how to remove the organs cleanly without damaging the flesh. His hands guided hers. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, without the anxiety that modern parents sometimes bring to teaching dangerous things to small children. The knife was sharp. It needed to be sharp, or it would slip. She needed to learn to use it correctly. She focused hard. By the 4th fish, she was doing it on her own. He watched without commenting. She got it right. Good, he said simply. She looked up at him. His face was already turned back to his own fish, but there was something in the line of his shoulders, a slight ease, a relaxation, that told her what she needed to know. By midday, the farm was in full activity. A neighbor had come by mid-morning, a man from the next farm along the fjord, perhaps a 20-minute walk away, who needed to borrow a particular tool. In the Norse world, neighbors were genuinely interdependent. Farms were small, resources were limited, and the exchange of tools, labor, and food was a constant informal economy that knit communities together. The two men stood in the yard for a while after the tool was retrieved, talking. They talked about the weather, always important, always uncertain, always consequential for farming people. The neighbor thought there might be rain before the end of the week. The farmer was not so sure. They looked at the sky together, reading it the way men who depend on weather always learn to read it. Not just the immediate clouds, but the shape of them, the direction of the wind, the particular quality of the morning light. They talked about a boat that had come up the fjord 2 days ago, strangers, traders from the south. The neighbor had spoken with them briefly. They had iron goods for trade and were looking for dried fish and furs. The farmer made a mental note. He had a good supply of dried fish from the winter catch and might have some to spare. They talked about the ting, the assembly, which was due to be held in perhaps 3 weeks at the traditional gathering place further along the coast. There was a dispute between 2 farms over grazing rights on a piece of hillside pasture that would need to be resolved. Both men would attend and have opinions, as was their right and their duty. The neighbor took his tool and went home. The farmer went back to his wall repairs. Inside the longhouse, the midday preparations were underway. The day meal was the more substantial of the two daily feats, and it was served around midday when the morning's work had created genuine hunger. Today there would be fish stew. The freshly caught cod, cleaned and cut into pieces, went into the pot along with onions, small pungent Norse onions, very different from the mild modern varieties, and turnips, which were one of the most important vegetables in the Norse diet. Dried herbs from the bundles hanging in the rafters, dill, which the Norse called dill then as now, and something pungent and aromatic that we might recognize as a kind of wild thyme, salt, and water, enough to make a thick broth. The stew simmered for a long time, filling the longhouse with an extraordinarily good smell. With it she would serve bread, fresh baked this morning, still slightly warm, and a wooden board of skyr and butter, and the last of a small wheel of hard cheese that was nearly finished. She called the family in from outside with a single word. They came, her husband with dirt on his hands from the wall work, Astrid slightly damp from a trip to the spring to fetch more water, Leif with a cut on his knee from some adventure she had not witnessed and was not entirely sure she wanted to hear about. They sat together around the fire. The stew was ladled into bowls. They ate. There is something deeply human about this moment that crosses every boundary of time and culture. The family gathered around the fire, the food hot and good, the children eating with the focused enthusiasm of growing bodies, the parents talking quietly about the afternoon's work, the dog lying hopefully nearby. The Norse were not so different from us. They loved their children with ferocity. They worried about the harvest and the weather and the winter. They enjoyed good food and warm drink and the company of people they cared about. They told jokes. The Norse sagas are full of dry, sardonic humor, and sang songs and told stories and complained about difficult neighbors and celebrated good fortune. They were people, fully, completely, recognizably people. The fire burned, the stew steamed. The family ate their midday meal at a farm on a fjord 1100 years ago. The afternoon brought a visitor of a different kind. A young man, perhaps 17, appeared at the farm gate with a pack on his back. He was not from the immediate area. His accent, when he spoke, had the slightly different cadence of someone from further north. He was traveling south along the coast and needed, he said, somewhere to rest for the night. The husbandi looked at him for a moment. He was young and thin, with quick eyes and good manners. He had a knife at his belt, but nothing that suggested trouble. He was exactly the kind of traveler the Norse hospitality code was designed to protect. "Come in," said the farmer. "You can sleep here tonight." This was not an unusual occurrence. The network of Norse hospitality meant that travelers rarely needed to sleep in the open. A farm, a fishing settlement, a small village. There was almost always somewhere to stay, in exchange for news from the road and whatever small gifts a traveler might carry. This young man carried, among other things, a small parcel of amber. Amber, fossilized tree resin, golden and warm and faintly luminous, was one of the most prized decorative materials in the Norse world and beyond. It came primarily from the shores of the Baltic Sea, where it washed up in quantities after storms, and it traveled along the great Norse trade networks to every corner of the known world. He laid 3 pieces of it on the low table, a long flat board on short legs around which the family gathered, and the husfreyja picked them up one by one and held them toward the fire. They glowed like small captured suns. She was not uninterested. "What do you want for them?" she asked, and the negotiation began. Trade was the heartbeat of the Viking Age, and it was conducted at every level, from the great international markets of Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden, where merchants from the Arab world and Byzantium and Western Europe converged to exchange silks and silver and slaves and furs, to this, a quiet conversation in a farmhouse kitchen, a young traveler with amber and a farm wife who knew exactly what the amber was worth. She traded him a supply of dried fish, more than enough for several days of travel, and a small wrapped portion of hard cheese. He accepted this with evident satisfaction. She placed the amber carefully in her wooden chest. In the afternoon's quieter hours, with the young traveler resting on a sleeping bench, the farmer sat outside in the warm sun working on the new plow handle. The ash wood had soaked well and was now flexible enough to work with. He had a small collection of tools: a broad axe for rough shaping, a draw knife for smoothing, a small knife for the fine work. He worked slowly and carefully, turning the wood in his hands, feeling for the grain, shaving away what wasn't needed. Woodworking was not a separate profession in this world. Every Norse farmer needed to be competent with wood. Houses, boats, furniture, tools, weapons, the framework of daily life were all made of wood, and the ability to cut and shape and join it was simply part of being a functioning adult in this society. As he worked, he thought about the trading ship that had come up the fjord. He did have fish to spare. He also had, stored carefully in the chest in the longhouse, a small quantity of iron that he had not yet used, acquired last autumn. Iron was always worth trading, and he needed before winter a new axe head and possibly a replacement lock for one of the storage chests. Trade for a Norse farmer was not a grand economic activity. It was practical. You traded what you had for what you needed. You drove a fair bargain. You did not cheat because your reputation for fair dealing was one of the most valuable things you possessed, and reputations in a small coastal community traveled fast and lasted long. Honor in the Norse world was not an abstract concept. It was intensely practical. It governed trade. It governed relationships. It determined whether your neighbors would help you when your barn burned down or your crop failed. A man or woman of poor reputation, dishonest, unreliable, unkind, would find the world increasingly cold and difficult. A person of good reputation found doors open, hands extended, alliances available. The farmer shaped his plow handle in the afternoon sun and thought about the trading ship, and decided he would go down to the harbor in the morning. This is a good moment to look outward, because while most Norse people spent their lives as farmers and fishermen, the world they inhabited was connected, in ways that would have astonished anyone living in, say, central France or rural England at the same period, to the farthest corners of the known world. The Norse were the greatest sailors of the early medieval period. Their ships were technological marvels. The classic Viking longship, the type we think of when we imagine them, was a shallow draft double-ended vessel, clinker-built, meaning the planks overlapped like the scales of a fish. This construction method made the hull extraordinarily flexible. It could flex in heavy seas without cracking. The ships were light enough to be carried overland or to be dragged up onto beaches. They could sail in perhaps half a meter of water, shallow enough to penetrate rivers far inland. With these ships, the Norse went everywhere. They sailed west to the British Isles, to Ireland, to Iceland, to Greenland, and beyond. Leif Erikson, the famous Norse explorer whose father, Eric the Red, had settled Greenland, sailed to the coast of North America around the year 1000 AD, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. The Norse called this land Vinland. They established a settlement at a place we now call L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. They did not stay long, but they were there. They sailed east through the Baltic, down the great rivers of Russia, the Dnieper, the Volga, through the vast interior of the continent, trading and raiding and settling all the way to the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, which they called Miklagarder, the great city. Norse warriors served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors, the Varangian Guard, famous throughout the medieval world for their size and ferocity. They sailed south to the Mediterranean. They made contact with the Arab world, Norse silver hoards found in Scandinavia contained coins from as far away as Baghdad, physical evidence of trade connections that spanned the entire known world. Back on the farm by the fjord, most of this was distant. The farmer had never been to Constantinople. He had perhaps never been to Denmark. His world was local, the fjord, the neighboring farms, the small market town a day's walk along the coast. But the world reached him anyway. The amber from the Baltic that the young traveler carried, the small fragment of silk that his wife had acquired at a market 3 years ago and kept carefully folded in her chest. The silver coin, Arab with flowing Arabic script, that hung on a cord around her neck as a luck charm, its origin unknown, its journey to this Norwegian fjord mysterious and remarkable. The world was smaller than it seemed, and larger than anyone knew. The sun was moving toward the mountain now. In late spring at this latitude the days were long. The sun would not fully set until late in the evening, and even then the sky would retain a kind of luminous twilight for hours. This was the approaching season of the midnight sun, when in the far north the sun barely set at all. For the Norse, who had lived through the opposite extreme, the short days of midwinter, when the sun barely scraped above the horizon for a few hours, the long summer evenings were a gift, a reason for genuine joy. Work slowed. The farmer finished the plow handle. It had come out well, smooth and correctly curved, stronger than the one it replaced. He held it up and looked at it in the evening light, turned it in his hands, set it aside with quiet satisfaction. Astrid had spent the later afternoon helping her mother with the preparations for the evening meal, and then, when released, had gone to the edge of the home field with a piece of carved wood and a sharp knife, working at something she did not show anyone. Leif had spent approximately 40 minutes trying to catch frogs near the stream with moderate success. The young traveler had slept for several hours, and now sat in the yard watching the farm with the alert, interested gaze of someone far from home who finds everywhere new things to look at. Inside, the evening meal was underway. The nattmal, the night meal, was simpler than the midday feast. Often it was based on the leftovers of the day meal, supplemented with fresh bread or cold porridge, perhaps some dried fish or preserved meat. Tonight there was the remaining fish stew, reheated and thickened. There was fresh bread. There was ale for the adults and sweet water mixed with a little honey for the children. And because there was a guest, and because it was a mild evening, there was something more. The farmer brought out a small wrapped piece of smoked lamb, a luxury kept for occasions, and carved thin slices of it onto a wooden board. The smell of it in the warm evening air was extraordinary, smoky and rich and deeply savory. The young traveler's eyes widened slightly. They ate together, the family and their guest, around the central fire as the evening light came through the smoke hole above and turned the air inside the longhouse a warm amber gold. The conversation was easy and wide-ranging. The traveler told them about his journey, the farms he had passed, the weather he had encountered further north, a small fair that had taken place near a coastal town where a juggler from somewhere far to the south had performed tricks with fire and balls that had astonished everyone. The farmer told him about the trading ship. The husfreyja asked about conditions further north. She had a sister who had married and gone north several years ago, and any traveler from that direction was potentially a source of news. The traveler did not know her sister. He knew the area, though. He described it, the particular shape of the coastline, the large farm that dominated the harbor. She listened carefully, trying to match his description to her memory of letters, not letters she had read, because she could not read, but letters that had been read to her by a rune carver in the nearby village, carved messages from her sister, brief and formal in the way that runic inscriptions tended to be, but deeply welcome nonetheless. The fire burned down. Outside, the evening light faded very gradually to a soft pearlescent dusk. With the meal finished and the dishes, the wooden bowls, the simple spoons, cleaned and stacked, the household settled into the evening. This was the time for stories. In a world without books, without television, without any of the entertainment technologies we take for granted, the evening hours were filled by the human voice. Stories were not a leisure activity in the Norse world. They were a primary technology of culture. They were how history was preserved, how religious beliefs were transmitted, how moral values were communicated, how the community made sense of itself and its place in the cosmos. The sagas, those magnificent prose narratives that preserve so much of what we know about the Viking Age, were not written down until the 12th and 13th centuries, 200 or 300 years after the events they describe. Before that, they lived in memory. Every community had people who specialized in this oral preservation. Poets called skalds, who composed intricate, allusion-dense verse that was specifically designed to be memorable, to resist change, to carry the past intact into the future. But ordinary storytelling, at the fireside in the longhouse between families and travelers, was everyone's domain. The farmer was not a skald. He had no special gift for verse, but he was a good storyteller, and his children loved to hear him. Tonight, with the young traveler listening and the fire low and comfortable, he told a story about Odin, not one of the formal myths, not the grand cosmological narratives about the creation of the world or the fate of the gods. Something smaller and stranger. A story about a farmer who encountered a wandering old man at a crossroads, a man with one eye and a wide-brimmed hat, who asked for food and gave a riddle in return. The riddle took the farmer 3 years to understand. When he finally did, his crops never failed again. It was a simple story, but it carried within it a whole theology. The Norse gods were not remote, abstract, or particularly dignified. They walked the world, they tested mortals. They had favorites and enemies among ordinary people. They made deals. They could be tricked, as Thor was tricked by giants, as Loki tricked everyone. They aged. The Norse gods, unlike the immortal gods of Greece and Rome, would grow old and die at Ragnarok, the end of the world, in a great battle that consumed everything. This cosmic fragility was, paradoxically, one of the most humanizing aspects of Norse religion. Even the gods were mortal. Even the gods faced a fate they could not escape. This made courage not just admirable, but necessary. If even Odin could not escape death, then the only meaningful response to mortality was to face it without flinching. The Norse afterlife beliefs were complex and somewhat contradictory. Different sources give different pictures. The most famous, Valhalla, was Odin's hall, where warriors slain in battle went to feast and fight until Ragnarok. But Valhalla was one of many possible destinations. The goddess Freya claimed half of the battle slain for her own hall, Folkvang. The goddess Hel ruled a vast underworld called Hel, not a place of punishment, simply a realm of the dead, where most people ended up. There were other options too, depending on how you lived and how you died. What unified these beliefs was not a specific afterlife geography, but a specific attitude toward living. Live with courage, keep your word, be generous, protect your family, honor the gods, face what comes without complaint. These were the values woven into every story told by firelight in every longhouse across the Norse world. Life fell asleep during the story. He always did. His father's voice, slow and warm, was the reliable signal that the day was truly ending, that safety was absolute, that nothing was required of him anymore. His father carried him to the sleeping bench without interrupting himself, laid him down, covered him with fur, went on with the story. Religion was not separate from daily life in the Viking Age. There was no separation, as we might make it, between the sacred and the secular. The gods were present in everything, in the names of the days of the week: Wednesday for Odin, Woden's Day; Thursday for Thor; Friday for Frigg or Freya; in the carving on a doorpost, in the small amulet worn around the neck, in the words spoken before planting the first seed of the season. The Thor's hammer amulet, Mjolnir, is perhaps the most recognizable symbol of Norse paganism. Thousands of them have been found across the Norse world, made of everything from silver to iron to antler bone, worn as pendants by both men and women. They were protective charms, yes, but they were also declarations of identity and faith, worn openly and with pride in the same way that a Christian of the same period might wear a cross. In a household like this one, religious observance was informal and continuous. A small wooden carving of Thor sat in a niche near the door, a rough, powerful figure with a hammer in one raised hand. Before going out on the water, the farmer touched it, not with elaborate ceremony, just a quick touch, a brief internal acknowledgement. This was how it was done. There were larger religious events throughout the year, the blot or sacrifice, which was a communal feast and ritual held at certain points in the agricultural calendar. The great blot at midwinter, the Yule, was the most important, a feast in the depth of the darkest season that was both religious observance and psychological survival, a declaration that the light would return, that the gods had not abandoned the world, that life would continue. The Yule traditions, the bringing in of evergreen boughs, the lighting of fires to drive back the darkness, the feasting and gift-giving and gathering of family, were so deeply embedded in Norse culture that when Christianity arrived in Scandinavia and began to displace the old religion, it could not dislodge these customs. It simply absorbed them. Many of our modern Christmas traditions are Norse Yule traditions in Christian dress, but we are in late spring, not midwinter. In late spring, the religious mood was one of gratitude and hope. The darkness had been survived. The planting was done. The animals were healthy. The fishing was good. Before sleeping, the Husfreyja spent a few quiet moments alone by the fire. She did not speak aloud. This was private, between her and whatever she believed in, which was not a simple thing to define. The Norse religious world was rich and complicated, full of local spirits as well as the great gods, the spirits of particular trees, particular streams, particular rocks. The land itself was alive with presence. She was grateful tonight for the good catch her husband had brought in, for the amber, for the children healthy and growing, for the young traveler safely under her roof, for the barley coming in green and straight and promising in the field. She fed a small piece of flatbread to the fire, an old gesture, older than memory. Then she banked the coals for the night, checked the children one more time, and lay down in the warmth. The night settled over the farm. Outside, the fjord was silver under a high, bright moon. The mountains were black shapes against a sky that was never quite fully dark at this time of year. A deep, soft blue-gray that held just enough light to see the water below and the snow on the highest peaks above. An owl called from the birch trees at the edge of the home field. The dog shifted in its sleep near the barn door. Inside the longhouse, the fire was low. The banked coals cast a faint red glow that moved gently on the carved roof beams. The smoke from the hearth rose slowly upward through the hole in the roof, dispersing into the night air. The family slept. Leif had not stirred since his father set him down. He slept with the absolute completeness of a healthy young child, deeply, entirely, his small chest rising and falling, his hands loosely curled. The baby slept between her siblings, warm and still. Astrid lay awake for a little while. She was thinking about the piece of wood she had been carving. It was a horse, or it was supposed to be a horse. The shape was right. she thought, the arch of the neck, the 4 legs. But the face was not right yet. The face needed more work. She would do it tomorrow, in the afternoon. She thought about the young traveler and where he was going, and what was further south along the coast that she had not seen. She thought about her aunt far to the north. She thought about the amber and how it had glowed in the firelight, and then she stopped thinking and slept. The husfreyja lay still, listening to the sounds of the sleeping household with a kind of quiet alertness that mothers throughout all of human history have known, the way a part of you stays slightly awake even in sleep, tuned to the small sounds of children, ready to hear the change that would mean someone needed you. The fire was safe. The coals were contained. The door was barred. She closed her eyes. The farmer lay on his back with one arm behind his head, looking up at the smoke hole and the small patch of moonlit sky visible through it. He was thinking, vaguely, about the trading ship, about the plow handle, about whether to replant the small far field with oats this year or leave it fallow to recover. The thoughts moved slowly, loosening their hold. The smell of the longhouse was the smell of his entire life. Wood smoke and animal warmth and the faint sweetness of hay and the deeper undertone of the earth itself, the turf of the walls and the earthen floor. It was the smell of safety, of home. He had not traveled. He was not a raider. He was not a skald or a chieftain or a legendary explorer. He was a farmer on a fjord with good land and a good wife and healthy children and a plow handle he was proud of. And the barley was coming in straight and green, and tomorrow he would go down to the harbor to speak to the traders, and tonight the world was entirely as it should be. He slept. The young traveler slept, full of smoked lamb and warm bread and gratitude. The dog slept near the door. The owl in the birch trees had gone quiet. The fire breathed its low red breath into the darkness. And outside, the fjord lay still and silver under the Norse night sky, holding the reflection of the moon and the stars and the mountains and the farm in its cold, clear, ancient water. A world that had been there before any of them were born and would be there long after, carrying its light forward into time. Let us linger a little longer in this world before we let it go, because there is more to tell. The Norse world was not simple. It was not the world of brutish warriors and passive women that the old stereotypes suggest. It was a sophisticated, legally complex, culturally rich civilization, and some of its aspects would have surprised even modern people. Take the legal status of Norse women. In medieval Europe, women were generally, in law as in practice, subordinate to men in almost every respect. They could not own property. They could not represent themselves in court. They had no independent legal identity. Marriage transferred ownership of a woman from her father to her husband, and that was essentially that. Norse women were different. A Norse woman could own property in her own right. She could inherit. She could divorce her husband, a remarkable right in this era, by calling witnesses and declaring 3 times, once at the bed, once at the door, and once at the main assembly, that she was divorcing him. In some circumstances, she could even challenge her treatment in law. Widows had extensive independent rights over property and household management. This did not mean the Norse world was an egalitarian paradise. It was not. The world of public life, trade, the Ting assembly, warfare, was primarily male. A woman's domain was the household, and while her authority there was real and legally recognized, it was not the same as freedom to operate in all spheres of society, but it was significantly more than what most contemporary cultures offered. The Ting itself, the assembly of free men, was one of the most interesting institutions in the Norse world. At regular intervals, the free men of a region would gather at a designated place, often a flat open area near a river or the coast, to conduct the business of the community. This was participatory governance in an era when the concept was rare. Laws were recited aloud by a person called a law speaker, a man who had memorized the entire legal code and whose job was to recite 1/3 of it at each annual assembly, ensuring that the law remained known and consistent. Disputes were argued, judgments were rendered, new laws could be proposed and debated. This tradition, the Norse ting, is one of the oldest roots of modern democratic institutions. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 AD, is considered the world's oldest surviving parliament. Other parliaments carry the name ting to this day, such as the Danish Folketing. The idea that free people had the right to participate in their own governance, to speak and be heard, to challenge even the powerful in a recognized public forum, this was not a universal idea in the early medieval world. In Scandinavia, it was simply how things were done. Our farmer would attend the ting in 3 weeks. He would vote, not with a ballot, but with the ancient method of raising weapons to signal assent on the matter of the grazing rights dispute. He would hear the legal arguments and form an opinion. He would speak if he had something worth saying. He would be heard. He was not a nobleman. He was not special. He was simply a free man, and being a free man meant these tings. The Norse people measured time differently from us. Their calendar was lunar, based on the cycles of the moon, and divided into 2 seasons rather than 4, the winter half and the summer half. The year began in the autumn at a festival called the Winter Nights, when the nights were visibly lengthening. The year turned again in the spring at a festival called Sigurblot, celebrating the coming warmth. This 2-season year made a deep kind of sense in Scandinavia. Winter was not 1/4 of existence. It was half of it. The Norse lived with winter in a way that people in more temperate climates cannot quite imagine. The months of darkness and cold that pressed in from every direction, shortening the days to a few pale hours, making every trip outside an act of preparation and courage, making every stored barrel of grain and every stack of firewood a matter of survival. Surviving the winter was not automatic. It was an achievement. The preparations for winter began almost as soon as summer reached its peak. The fishing intensified. The hunting intensified. The smoking and salting and drying of food was a continuous occupation from midsummer until the first frosts. Firewood was cut, split, and stacked. Animals were assessed, which could be kept through the winter on stored fodder, and which would need to be slaughtered and preserved, their meat salted or smoked or frozen in the cold air. The slaughter, which typically happened in the early winter, was called the winter slaughter. It was a time of hard work and also, paradoxically, of relative abundance. Fresh meat was available briefly before the preservation was complete. Feasting at this time was both practical and celebratory. Then the long dark came. The Norse word for this period, the deep midwinter darkness, was myrkur. It means simply dark, but the weight of the word goes deeper than its translation. It is the darkness that presses in, the darkness that must be actively resisted. The midwinter feast, Yule, was the great resistance. Fire, food, family, stories, ale, laughter. A declaration against the dark that the dark could not answer. And then, eventually, the light returned. The Norse word for this return, the first perceptible lengthening of the days, was associated with joy in a way that is hard to fully translate. The lengthening of the light was not just astronomical, it was moral, it was theological. It meant the gods had kept their end of the bargain. It meant the world would not end this year. It meant spring and planting and fish in the fjord and children running in green fields. Our farmer, on this spring morning, carries all of this in his body. He does not think about it in these terms. He simply feels on a morning like this, with the sun warm and the barley green and the fjord bright, a specific quality of gladness that is inseparable from having survived the dark. He is glad to be alive. He is glad to be here. He is glad that the world goes on. Let us return to the longhouse now. The night has fully come, or as fully as it comes at this time of year. The sky is a deep blue that holds, in the north, a thin line of gold along the horizon, the last remnant of the long Nordic evening. The household is asleep. The fire breathes. In this small farm on this Norwegian fjord, in the year around 900 AD, all the human things are present. Love and worry and hope and work and bread and fire and children and sleep. The things that do not change. The farmer will wake tomorrow, check the barley, and go to speak to the traders, and perhaps begin cutting the timber for the roof repair. He will look at the sky, read the weather, and decide when to take the boat out. He will carry stones for the wall. He will plane the wood with patient, practiced hands. The husfreyja will weave. She will feed the family. She will manage the household with the firm, clear competence that is her greatest gift and her greatest pride. She will check on the stores. She will note that the cheese is almost finished and make a new one. She will keep the keys. Astrid will finish the horse she is carving. It will be better than she expects. Leif will catch a frog and keep it briefly as a pet before it escapes, and this will cause him tremendous grief for approximately one afternoon. The young traveler will leave in the morning with dried fish in his pack and a brief thanks that is genuine and simple, and he will walk south along the fjord and become part of the great network of movement and connection that characterizes the Viking Age, carrying news and amber and the story of a hospitable farm by the water. All of this will happen, but not yet. Now there is only the fire, the sleeping family, the dog near the door, the moonlight on the water. The owl has started calling again, its long, soft call carrying across the farmyard and out over the fjord, over the still water, over the silver darkness of the Norse night. There is no hurry. There is nowhere to be. The world is very old and very quiet. The Viking Age lasted roughly 300 years. In those 300 years, the Norse people changed the map of the world. They settled Iceland and Greenland. They reached North America. They founded the city of Dublin. They established the kingdom of Normandy in France, and it was the descendants of Norse settlers in Normandy who conquered England in 1066 in the event that historians mark as the end of the Viking Age. They traded with Baghdad and Constantinople. They carved their names in runic letters on the balustrades of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, where the inscriptions can still be seen today. They buried their dead in ships under mounds with everything they might need in the next world: swords and combs and cooking pots and gaming pieces and the bones of their horses. They told stories. They raised children. They built long houses against the dark and cold, and inside those houses they kept fires burning through the longest winters in the world, and around those fires they gathered their families and their neighbors and their travelers and their dogs, and they ate and talked and laughed and argued and fell asleep to the sound of stories being told. They were people, completely, recognizably, deeply people. And now you know a little of how they lived, the texture of their days, the weight of their wooden bowls, the smell of their fires, the sound of an owl calling across a fjord on a spring night 1100 years ago. You are warmly invited to carry these images with you now into sleep. The longhouse is warm. The fire is low and safe. The family is safe. The barley is growing. Tomorrow will come, and there will be work, and it will be manageable work, the kind of work that builds things slowly over time. But tonight there is only this, the breathing of people who are loved, the slow red pulse of the fire, the moonlight on the water, the deep, enormous, patient dark of the Norse night, full of stars and silence and the sound of the sea. Sleep well.